I'd like to give everybody a big thank you taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us tonight for our webinar. This should be a very exciting webinar. The topic tonight is IgG food sensitivity and disease. Having struggled with food sensitivities all my life and seen firsthand with both myself and in my patients how greatly food sensitivities impact our health, I wanted to shed some light on this topic for those that do not know about food sensitivities and who might be interested in having a test like this done on themselves, their families, or friends. With that, let's get started. A little bit about me. My name is Dr. Matthew Cavaiola. I am a licensed naturopathic medical doctor and a licensed acupuncturist in the state of Arizona. Received my doctorate degree from the Southwest College of Naturopathic Medicine located in Tempe, Arizona. I also graduated from the Phoenix Institute of Herbal Medicine and Acupuncture where I received a master's degree in acupuncture. I'm also a graduate of the University of Delaware, Go Blue Hens, where I received both a bachelor's degree in biological sciences and a master's degree in nutrition. And recently, I started a clinic called the Phoenix Anti-Aging Clinic here in Arizona, where I specialize in treating many chronic conditions and diseases associated with the aging process. For those who are not familiar about what a naturopathic doctor is, we kind of take a holistic approach and obviously use natural therapeutics to treat many conditions and diseases. I use therapies like clinical nutrition and supplementation, intravenous nutrient therapy, acupuncture, and I'm really excited to have recently acquired a hyperbaric oxygen chamber in my practice. For more information on all the conditions that I treat and modalities that I use in my practice, feel free to visit my website at www.phoenixantiagingclinic.com. Let's take an example. Let's take a prostate example, for example. That was a little redundant. So obviously you have a healthy prostate, and when we talk about prostate, we talk about PSA, which is basically prostate-specific antigen. That's essentially the lab value, the blood value that can tell us how much inflammation is in the prostate gland. So a PSA value less than 1 is associated typically with a healthy prostate gland. Anything between a 1 and 4, and the patient usually is displaying some degree of inflammation in the prostate gland. And anything between 4 and 10, the risk for developing prostate cancer goes up dramatically. So what along this continuum, what happens to cause this inflammation in the prostate gland? A whole host of factors that can lead to inflammation of the prostate, including poor diet, food sensitivities, alcohol use, smoking, overgrowth of Candida and other pathogens, and even environmental exposure. So this model is great because it can kind of tell you, hey, you're healthy here, you're inflamed here, and you're diseased here. So really what we're trying to do as naturopathic doctors is to, and any integrative practitioner for that model, is really try to get people going in the other direction and really working on people's and finding out the root cause of individuals' inflammation. So that's really where food sensitivities come into play here, as we know that food sensitivities cause a great deal of inflammation, and we'll talk more about that here in a couple of minutes. So where does inflammation start? Well, believe it or not, it's estimated that over 70% of the immune and the inflammatory system is actually found in the gastrointestinal tract. And there's essentially 3 major components to the gastrointestinal immune system, 3 of which include the GALT, gut-associated lymphoid tissue, and don't worry, you'll not be quizzed on any of this at the end of the presentation, gastrointestinal microflora, the biological terrain as I like to call it, and the gastrointestinal integrity. All 3 of those components really they lead to a sound and healthy gastrointestinal tract. So let's talk a little bit about the gastrointestinal tract in general. It's one of the largest interfaces between the quote-unquote outside world and the human internal environment. From mouth to anus, the GI tract is approximately 9 meters long and actually covers about 250 to 400 square meters. Over the course of a lifetime, approximately 60 tons of food will pass through the GI tract. And although food is extremely important for our well-being, the passage through the GI tract can also constitute a threat to our health, believe it or not. So amongst all the functions of the GI tract, a couple of its most important functions is obviously to digest and absorb nutrients. And food that passes through the GI tract provides exposure to not only dietary antigens, but also viable microorganisms and also bacterial products. So let's discuss one of the first components of the gastrointestinal immune system. This is something called the GALT, and it's one subtype of a lymphoid tissue called the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. This is found scattered throughout the body, and not only is located in the gastrointestinal tract, but also in the lungs, the nasal passages, and in the vagina in women. It's the GALT happens to be the largest collection of lymphoid tissues in the body, and it consists of lymph nodes, Peyer's patches, and also scattered lymphocytes. It's located all along the gastrointestinal tract from the esophagus to colon, and the GALT is really designed to protect the body from an enormous quantity and variety of microbes and also food antigens, while still helping to absorb those crucial nutrients that we need to sustain life. This is a great schematic that I like to use to kind of show what the GALT looks like. Here, lining the gastrointestinal tract is the epithelium. This is basically where the cells that line the gastrointestinal tract and are responsible for absorbing nutrients. Here, shown in yellow, is what's known as the follicle, which basically is filled with B cells. And in this blue area is the T cell area. So the B cells and T cells are specialized inflammatory cells that actually help to neutralize infections and other antigens as they move through the gastrointestinal tract. The picture on the right is basically the same thing, but taken under a light microscope. And here in the middle is the germinal center. Around the germinal center is the B cell area, or the follicle. And up here in the left-hand corner, you can see this light shaded area, which is the T cell area. So a little bit more about the GALT. It's fully developed after full-term birth. So during in utero, a baby is actually developing his or her GALT. And really the protective function of this component of the inflammatory system requires microbial stimulation, which happens during initial bacterial colonization during infancy. Breastfed babies, they basically receive prebiotics, which are food to help the normal intestinal flora grow adequately. And this includes two bacterial species, including Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium. These two bacteria can also help to protect the newborn from harmful age-related intestinal infections. And it's been shown, actually, that formula-fed infants have a more complex flora made up of bifidobacteria, bacteroids, clostridia, and streptococci. And these infants actually have been shown to be more vulnerable to gastrointestinal and other infections. So next, let's talk about the gastrointestinal microflora, or the biological terrain. The normal microflora of the GI tract is actually an ecosystem in and of itself. Each person, believe it or not, has their own different GI microflora. So what's normal for one person may actually cause disease in another person. And this microflora basically depends on different people's dietary and lifestyle habits, their environment, their body chemistry, and also their immune system. The bacteria in our gut live symbiotically with us, which means that basically we receive good stuff from the bacteria, and we also give them stuff of our own. So basically, it's a give and take relationship. And these bacteria generally cause no harm. Our gastrointestinal flora is typically composed of over 500 species of bacteria, and the average adult human can actually have 10 to the 14th, that's a very, very large number, viable microorganisms, which is actually 10 times the number of human cells found within the body. And believe it or not, it's estimated that we have up to 3 pounds of bacteria in our gut. Wow. So what are some of the roles of microflora in humans? Well, it helps to stimulate our immune system, which is one of the most important functions of the gastrointestinal flora. It helps to synthesize vitamins, including biotin and vitamin K. It helps to enhance the GI tract motility and function. It helps with digestion and nutrient absorption. It helps to inhibit pathogens, metabolism of plant compounds and drugs, and the production of things like short-chain fatty acids. So what happens, what can cause the GI microflora to become out of balance? Well, one of the leading causes of killing GI microflora is through the use of antibiotic use, which things like broad-spectrum antibiotics like Cipro basically wipe out almost the entire gastrointestinal flora. And it's very, very hard to recuperate over time. Other things that can alter the GI microflora balance include psychological and physical stress, radiation, and dietary changes. So now we've talked about the GALT, we've talked about the microflora. What's really, really important is that, believe it or not, these two parts of the immune system actually come together to enhance the immune system. So colonization with normal bacteria flora in the GI tract is a basic defense mechanism of the body against infections. And for this process to occur, actually the colonizing bacteria must communicate with the underlying epithelium. And this communication is what leads to metabolic and immunological reactions by the epithelial cell when it comes across these pathogens and other antigens. This communication between the intestinal bacteria and the gut is what's termed microbial epithelial crosstalk. This is a great picture that kind of helps to depict what I was just talking about. This is an electron microscope view, actually, of these bacteria, these spherical-shaped things here. One's this way and one's the other way. And basically interacting with the villi, the epithelial cells lining the intestinal tract. So it's through this crosstalk that the immune system is enhanced. Okay, so the last component of the inflammatory system that we'll discuss today is the gastrointestinal epithelial barrier, or gastrointestinal integrity. Normally, the cells that line our intestinal tract are very close together, and they're basically joined together by what's known as a tight junction, as you can see here in between these two cells. The tight junction allows the selective passage of only certain nutrients and other substances from the lumen of the gastrointestinal tract to the bloodstream. And essentially, the bloodstream is on this other end of the epithelial cells. Over 85% of the transport of nutrients is termed paracellular, or through these tight junctions. And another 15% is basically through the cell itself. So the majority of absorption takes place through these tight junctions. So it's very, very important that these tight junctions are in place so they don't allow the passage of other substances from the lumen of the intestinal tract to the bloodstream. So some functions of the GI epithelial barrier. Well, one of them is absorption, as we already talked about. And this helps to transport fluids, electrolytes, and nutrients selectively across the intestinal wall. Another one is protection, separating larger, non-absorbable, toxic, antigenic, or pathogenic molecules or organisms from reaching the blood. And the last one, which is in relationship to our talk tonight, is immunity. it actually helps to secrete immunoglobulins, mainly secretory IgA, which helps to bind to bacteria and other antigens. And it really, all three of these components need to be functioning well for the health of the GI epithelium to be sustained. And the rest of the body, basically any disruption in this can cause an increase in GI permeability. So what are some of these factors that can compromise the integrity of the intestinal wall? Well, one of the most important ones is foods. And things like gluten and dairy actually can damage the tight junctions and can damage the epithelial barrier, causing things to be able to leak into the bloodstream. A variety of medications can also cause damage to the intestinal wall, including antibiotics and NSAIDs. And for those who are not familiar, NSAIDs are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Not only do antibiotics damage the intestinal wall, but they actually, again, alter the intestinal flora and cause an increased risk of overgrowth by opportunistic bacteria or fungi. Altered gut ecology and bacterial overgrowth had actually been shown to lead to bacterial and or yeast translocation across the gut barrier into the lymphatic system and bloodstream. And once it's there, that's where it starts to cause problems. Other factors that compromise the integrity of the gastrointestinal barrier include viral and bacterial infections, alcohol, radiation, trauma, surgery, and even stress. So this is kind of a timeline or a schematic showing basically what happens when you go from healthy to damaged intestinal lining. Here you can see the normal lining of the intestinal tract, which is normally supposed to have these little microvilli, these finger-like projections. And it's these projections that help with the absorption of nutrients. With damage to this intestinal wall, with inflammation, basically what happens is that the intestinal lining becomes damaged, and these finger-like projections no longer exist. The other thing that happens is essentially you get these holes or crypts located between cells. And this is where some of this leakage of harmful substances and antigens can take place. Here you can see the intestinal lining, and on the other side of the intestinal lining is the bloodstream. So once the tight junctions are not so tight anymore, once they become loosened, for lack of better terms, toxins, undigested food particles, yeast, fungi, parasites, and harmful bacteria can essentially permeate the intestinal lining and enter the bloodstream. And this is what's known as leaky gut syndrome. And we see this oftentimes a lot with respect to food sensitivities. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So what happens once something enters the bloodstream? Well, basically your body views this like any other bacteria, virus, yeast. It even views food as a foreign substance. These foreign substances are called antigens, and your body basically has two ways of helping to deal with these antigens. Well, the first one is called the innate or natural immune system, and this system is really designed to kind of help to keep this infection or antigen in check initially until what's known as the adaptive immune system can help to eliminate the pathogen. And the adaptive immune system, this piece to the puzzle usually takes anywhere from 3 to 5 days. So let's talk a little bit more about the adaptive system. So again, if the foreign antigen basically it escapes the first system there and enters the bloodstream, it'll encounter a B cell. We talked about B cells a little bit earlier. And each B cell basically has a receptor on its surface that matches a particular antigen, whether it be a bacteria, a virus, a yeast, or a food particle. Once that antigen binds to the B cell, immature B cells are then converted into antibodies, which are specific for the antigen. So during the primary immune response, the first time this antigen binds, the primary antibody produced is IgM. As the antigen binds repeatedly to the same antibodies, what happens is that the antibody switches from IgM to IgG. And it's this IgG reaction is what we're trying to measure when we're talking about food sensitivities. The other important thing to note is that some B cells become memory cells, which basically helps us to have a quicker reaction to the food antigen or the bacteria or the virus the next time we're exposed to it. So basically, we have these memory cells which say, oh, okay, I remember this, and so they actually elicit a response a lot quicker. The other thing to note is that this process sometimes takes days to develop, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but oftentimes delayed sensitivity reactions can take anywhere from 3 hours to 3 days later, and it's part of this humoral immune system that has to do with that delay in the reaction. So I mentioned the word immunoglobulins a few times, and there's basically 4 major types of immunoglobulins. You have IgA, IgD, IgE, and IgG reactions. Each one of these immunoglobulins differs in the number and the types of the heavy and light chains that make up the molecule. As you can see here, this is a general structure of an immunoglobulin. There's heavy chains down here and light chains up here. So each one of these types of immunoglobulins has different light chains and heavy chains. So each one of these immunoglobulins has different functions in the body. IgA immunoglobulins basically are involved with the protection of the lining of the nasal passages and also the intestinal lining. IgE immunoglobulins are most widely known for their involvement in allergic reactions of all kinds. This includes anaphylaxis, which is basically when your throat closes up, and also urticaria or hives. Again, like we mentioned a couple seconds ago, IgM is the first antibody produced by the immune system when a new antigen is encountered. This is the body's early defense system. And then IgG antibodies are produced when a germ or a food antigen attacks in a subsequent invasion, and it can also be involved, as we mentioned, in causing food allergies and sensitivities. Okay. So now we have a good foundation knowledge of inflammation and the components of the immune system. We're now ready to discuss food sensitivities. So food sensitivities are also called food intolerances or delayed onset food sensitivities. And it's estimated that over 60% of the population has some degree of IgG food sensitivity. However, this is most likely a gross underestimation. It might be upwards of 90% of the population that has some degree of food sensitivity. A lot of conventional physicians doubt the existence of IgG-mediated or delayed onset food reactions, but a lot of naturopathic physicians, including myself, and other integrative practitioners recognize food sensitivities as a leading cause of many different conditions. So which foods are most problematic? Well, I like to term 5 major groups as the big 5 in my practice. This includes wheat and other gluten-containing grains, including rye, barley, and some oats, dairy, which includes 2 major proteins, whey and casein, corn, eggs, and soy. Those are the big 5. And when we're talking about food sensitivities, most people have one or even all of those foods that they find that they're sensitive to. Other foods, this is not an extensive list that people may be sensitive to, include nuts, seafood, pork, nightshades, which includes things like potatoes, tomatoes, onions, peppers, and eggplant, brewer's yeast, baker's yeast, chocolate, oh no, not chocolate, cane sugar, citrus fruits, coffee, and tea. So who should be evaluated for food sensitivities? Well, basically anybody with any of the following conditions would be a strong candidate for food sensitivity testing. I really truly believe that anyone, even if they don't have any of the conditions listed, could stand to benefit to know where their sources of inflammation are coming from in their diet. So obviously you can see here this list is very extensive, but includes anything from migraine headaches to gastrointestinal disorders to fatigue, any kind of aches and pains, including arthritis and fibromyalgia, respiratory disorders like asthma and rhinitis, recurrent ear and other quote-unquote infections, difficult weight loss, skin disorders, autism and ADHD, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and the list goes on. I didn't include acid reflux on here, which is one of the dead giveaways that you probably had food sensitivities. Things like acid reflux and sleep apnea and other types of allergies are usually associated with some degree of food sensitivity. So a lot of people have heard about food allergies. Well, what's the difference between food allergy and food sensitivity or food intolerance? So food allergies occur in only about 10% of the population. And this is where symptoms appear immediately, usually within minutes of eating a specific food. And it can manifest as anaphylaxis, hives, or other allergic reactions like sneezing, hay fever, after eating a particular food. These reactions are caused by a release of histamine from cells in your body called mast cells. And these food allergies typically are measured and diagnosed by either a skin prick test or a blood test. It's more commonly done with a skin prick test. And this is where a drop of solution containing a potential allergen, let's say peanuts, for example, is placed on the skin. A series of scratches or needle pricks allows this solution to enter the skin. And if the skin develops a red, raised, itchy area called a wheal, it usually means the person has some kind of allergy to that food, to that specific allergen. This can be used for both environmental allergens and also food allergens as well. It's very good at measuring these allergens. However, it's not very good at identifying delayed onset sensitivity reactions. Not only that, but a lot of times these tests are very, very painful for the individuals undergoing them. Okay, so this is a picture depicting basically what happens during food allergy or any other type of allergic response. Here, shown on the left-hand side, is what's known as a mast cell, as I mentioned earlier. Each one of these mast cells has little pockets or granules of histamine located within them. What happens is, and you can see here, these little square holes are receptors, and basically an allergen comes along, binds to the receptors located on the mast cell, and what happens is an IgE-mediated reaction takes place where the histamine granules basically pop out, as you can see here. And essentially histamine is released, and the histamine is responsible for causing all of those reactions that we described earlier. And antihistamines basically help to dry up the histamine that's been released during allergies. So the foods most commonly associated with food allergies, in young children, typically milk, soy, eggs, and wheat. Those seem to be the biggest food allergens for children. Most of the conventional research suggests that these typically resolve by school age. Oftentimes they do, but they also carry over into adulthood as well. To a lesser degree, other food allergens include things like peanuts, tree nuts, fish, and also shellfish. So we've talked about food allergies. So unlike food allergies, which typically develop rapidly, symptoms of delayed onset food sensitivities appear anywhere from hours to up to 3 days later after the ingestion of a food. Typically, it's not associated with the release of histamine, and it's not associated with anaphylactic shock, nor does it show up positive on a skin prick test. These delayed onset food sensitivities are extremely useful in getting to the root cause of many chronic conditions and psychiatric conditions as well. So why are IgG tests or IgG food sensitivity tests so important? Well, it's very difficult to identify a cause and effect relationship between specific foods that are causing symptoms up to 3 days later. I found in my clinical practice that most people can't recall foods that they ingested for breakfast, let alone 3 days prior. So this can actually help to make things like diet diaries useful but it doesn't always identify specific foods that are causing their symptoms. This is a typical diet diary that I use in my practice. Basically what I do is have a patient fill out 2 days worth of diet records for during the week and 1 day on the weekend, where basically they record everything that they ate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner on those 3 days, including all the ingredients that were in the food, as well as symptoms, weight gain and loss, and what time they had their symptoms, as well as what happened with their bowel movements during those days as well. And again, this diet diary is a great exercise because it can help to identify specific food sensitivities, but it's better for patients to actually be able to associate certain foods with certain reactions in their body. It's like, oh, I had a wheat sandwich for lunch, and now later on in the day I've got abdominal bloating. So sometimes it can really help to open a patient's eyes to, hey, there's a cause and effect relationship between the foods that I'm eating and the symptoms I'm experiencing. So what kind of confounds this whole thing with diet diaries is that there's something called allergy addiction syndrome, where patients actually often experience short-term relief after the ingestion of foods that are later to be found causative of their chronic symptoms. So this really can kind of help to jumble the whole situation, because the patient may not record, feeling great on their diet diary, and so, believe it or not, these types of syndromes, it's like a patient becomes euphoric after eating something. I hear a lot of this with things like chocolate or, things like carbohydrates, where people are like, it just makes me feel great. But later on in the day, you're crashing, you're tired, you're falling asleep at your desk. Those kinds of things typically are associated with an allergy addiction syndrome. So how are delayed onset food sensitivities diagnosed? Well, the gold standard is through an elimination food challenge. So this is basically, it happens in a number of steps. Basically, a patient's required to eat a completely hypoallergenic diet. One example is the Brenneman's hypoallergenic diet. So here you can see a list of the foods. These are all the foods that the patient is allowed to eat on the hypoallergenic diet: beets, lamb, apricots, etc., and nothing else, just those foods. So basically, the patient eats this diet until their symptoms clear or improve. This usually takes anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks, but it can take longer just depending on how severe the condition is. After their symptoms clear, the patient will then add in just one allergenic food at a time. So let's take eggs, for example. If the patient will eat just eggs 2 times per day for 2 to 3 days. If they have no reaction, then they'll add a new food in. They can go to wheat. If they do have a reaction, they'll stop eating eggs and they have to restart the diet again until their symptoms clear. Then they'll add in a different food and repeat. So as you can imagine, this elimination food challenge type of program can be very, very laborious. It can take months, if not years, to determine the foods that are the cause of one's symptoms. So that's really where IgG food intolerance comes into play. And many lab companies now offer convenient blood testing that can determine IgG food sensitivity to anywhere from 93 to 154 foods. The cost can vary anywhere from $200 to $400 per test, and not each company's testing results are as accurate as the next, unfortunately. The testing is usually ordered by an ND or other integrative type practitioner in their office. And what's great about these intolerance tests is that it really gives each patient an individualized profile to show exactly what foods they're sensitive to, not what their dad is sensitive to, not what their child is sensitive to, what they are sensitive to. And that's really, really important, because you don't have to go and eliminate everything in the big 5 or all of those foods that we talked about earlier. So that's a great way to, again, kind of get a profile of what you're sensitive to. One specific company that performs this type of IgG food intolerance test is the Great Plains Laboratory. Their food sensitivity test is 93 foods, and also sensitivity to Candida albicans, which is a yeast, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. The food sensitivity test is available both as a serum blood test and also as a finger stick blood spot. The finger stick is a sample collected on filter paper in a practitioner's office, and this is a great test for kids and other needle-phobic adults. The IgG food intolerance test through Great Plains tests 8 different categories of foods, including dairy, legumes, fruits, grains, fish, meats and fowl, nuts and seeds, and vegetable, and also a miscellaneous grouping of foods as well. So this is what, after the blood's drawn, sent off to Great Plains for interpretation, report comes back to a practitioner like myself, and he or she will go over the results with the patient. This is what a sample test result typically looks like. You can see on this result there's 4 different ranges on for each food. You have green, which indicates clinically insignificant. The yellow color is a low reaction to the specific food. This orange color is a moderate reaction, and this tangerine/red color is a severe reaction to that specific food. And as you can see here, there's different groupings of foods, including dairy, legumes, fruits, grains, fish, meat, fowl, nuts and seeds, vegetables, and this miscellaneous category, which includes, again, Candida, sugar, cocoa, coffee, honey, mushrooms, and also 2 types of yeast, baker's yeast and brewer's yeast. Another great thing about the results is that it also has this little summary box on the right-hand side, which basically just, you don't have to read through the whole thing. You can actually go to the summary and say, oh, okay, I remember I have a high reaction to Candida. And you can actually cut this out and bring it around with you, laminate it. It just kind of helps to remember. It's like when you're at a restaurant, you can say, oh, I can't eat that. I have a sensitivity to that. Okay. One of the most commonly asked questions by my patients, and deservingly so, is, okay, Dr. C, this looks like a great test, but how much does it cost? In these tough economic times, I can totally understand that. The cash price for this test basically varies with practitioner and also the state where it's run. Usually it's anywhere from $200 to $250. Another question I get oftentimes is, does insurance cover this test? And believe it or not, insurance will occasionally reimburse for the cost of this test. Great Plains now has a great insurance coverage verification and out-of-pocket expense guide. That's a tongue twister on their website, so you can see what your benefits look like. I'll take a couple of seconds here, and you can copy down this link here so you can use that. Okay, so now that we've talked about some of the ins and outs of the IgG food intolerance test from Great Plains, let's discuss some of the more commonly seen food sensitivities and their relationship to health. One food that seems to be found everywhere in our food supply, and it's linked to a plethora of human illnesses, is something called gluten. And many people now know about gluten. What's great is that as more and more people are diagnosed with gluten sensitivity and other gluten-associated disorders, there's more and more gluten-free products showing up in even regular grocery stores and health food stores. So really, it's a great sign that that the food industry is kind of waking up and recognizing some of these food sensitivities that people have. So what exactly is gluten? Well, gluten, along with gliadin, are 2 proteins found in many grains, especially in wheat. And what's so great about wheat for farmers in the food industry is that it's well adapted to harsh conditions and can be grown almost at any temperature. So it is able to survive during winters, unlike corn and rice, which are a little bit more fragile. The gluten found in wheat enables dough to rise, and this actually helps to produce the light, fluffy textured breads, rolls, muffins, and cakes that hit the shelves of every major grocery store in the country. As you can see in this figure, wheat, barley, and rye are all in the same tribe. So they're all very, very closely related to one another. Oats is in the same subfamily, but it's in a different tribe, but it's a little bit more closely related to these gluten-containing grains. And things like rice and millet are a little bit further along the spectrum, and these things, although they contain gluten and gliadin, most people do not have a reaction to rice and millet, and it's a different kind of gluten and gliadin found in these grains. So here's a gluten content of various grains, and as you can see here, wheat contains 10 to 15% total protein, and of this protein, 40 to 50% is gliadins and 30 to 40% is glutenins. So it's very, very high in gliadins and glutenins. Rye would be the second leading gluten-containing grain, and you can see here that oats is kind of in the middle. Rice is very low, millet's very low. So that again helps to demonstrate the fact that wheat and rye typically have the most amount of gluten in them. So what's so bad about gluten and gliadin? Well, it can cause something called celiac disease. And when we have a sensitivity or an intolerance to gluten, this is what causes celiac disease. It's also called celiac sprue and also gluten-sensitive enteropathy. We'll just call it celiac disease. Gluten is now known to cause a whole host of other gluten-associated diseases as well. And basically, the gluten is found in all forms of wheat, including durum, semolina, spelt, kamut, malt, couscous, bulgur, triticale, einkorn, and farro. All are instigators of celiac, as well as related grains, rye and barley as well. So how is celiac disease diagnosed? Well, typically it's diagnosed by blood antibody tests. The gold standard nowadays is the intestinal biopsy, which is quite invasive. Another way you can help diagnose celiac disease is through the mitigation of symptoms after removal of the dietary glutens. A serum IgG food intolerance test is another great way to provide information as to the degree of sensitivity to all gluten and gliadin-containing grains. It should be noted, though, that avoidance of gluten or gliadin for an extended period of time may actually give a false negative on a IgG test. So if you've been avoiding gluten for 3 months, 6 months already, you may not show up with a positive result on your food sensitivity test. So how does celiac disease start? Well, basically, the gluten found in wheat basically causes a disruption in the epithelial barrier in the lining of the small intestine. This, as we talked about before, sets off an inflammatory response, which results in destruction of surface epithelium and the flattening of mucosa. And a protein called zonulin basically unlocks the intestinal barrier and allows large peptides to be able to cross into the bloodstream. And again, this is the beginning of inflammation. And the development of leaky gut syndrome, which is basically where now you have all these particles, including food antigens and bacteria and viruses, being able to leak into the bloodstream. This is a great figure that shows the difference between normal, healthy lining of the intestines and also the intestines of those with celiac disease. So on the left here in picture A, you can see these normal finger-like projections, again called villi, which are the absorptive surface of the intestinal tract. As you can see, you've got all these little finger-like projections that stick upwards. In figure B, what happens is that this no longer exists, and it looks like a dry, barren desert. And basically, you lose the finger-like projections, you lose this absorptive capacity. Not only that, but like we talked about earlier, get some of these holes and crypts found between the cells, which causes the leaky gut syndrome to begin. This is viewed, I believe this is under a electron microscope here. Basically, again, you can see the finger-like projections shown here. And then in figure D, you basically have what's known as blunting of the intestinal mucosa. Now you have a flat mucosa, again, with these crypts and these holes found in between. So I mentioned earlier gluten-associated diseases. So gluten consumption is not only associated with just celiac disease, but many other conditions and illnesses that can be caused by the ingestion of gluten. It ranges anywhere from autoimmune conditions like Addison's disease to cystic fibrosis to epilepsy. I'm not going to name all these conditions, but if you or you know somebody that has some of these conditions, they should definitely consider getting some kind of celiac testing done and or having a food sensitivity test run. This is a sample IgG food intolerance panel from a patient with celiac disease, and as you can see here, the majority of their foods came up negative. This one here, it's cranberry, came up a little bit high. They must have been eating too much cranberry sauce around Thanksgiving. Or a gliadin was very, very high. Oats, which again are kind of in the middle. Some of them contain quite a lot of gluten, and some of them don't. I particularly eat only oats at this point that are known to be gluten-free, and also wheat gluten was very, very high. So this is very common amongst patients with celiac disease to see this kind of presentation. All right, the next food group that I'd like to discuss in relation to IgG food intolerance is dairy. The dairy food group includes things like cheese, all forms of animal milk, including cow, goat, and sheep milk, and also yogurt. The dairy group does not include eggs. I'm not sure when that rumor started. I have a number of patients who come back positive for the dairy group and say, can I eat eggs? Yes, you can eat eggs. Eggs are not dairy. Dairy sensitivity should be suspected for all conditions mentioned earlier on in this presentation, and the majority of symptoms related to dairy food intolerance seem to be related mostly to gastrointestinal, the respiratory tract, or to the skin. Oftentimes, a lot of times in children and also in adults, people with dairy sensitivities experience what's known as the atopic triad, which is eczema, allergic rhinitis, and asthma. So here's the list of conditions where IgG food sensitivities can be suspected from earlier in the webinar, and I've highlighted in bold the conditions where dairy consumption should especially be considered as a cause of concern. I've highlighted fatigue, gastrointestinal disorders, including IBS, inflammatory bowel disorder, Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, arthritis, asthma and rhinitis, recurrent ear and other infections, difficult weight loss, skin disorders, as we mentioned, and autism and ADHD. So many of the gastrointestinal symptoms associated with dairy consumption come from folks having what's known as a lactose intolerance. And believe it or not, upwards of 70% of the global population has a lactase deficiency. And lactase is basically the enzyme that helps to break down lactose, the primary sugar found in dairy products, into two sugars, galactose and glucose, for absorption. Lactase is naturally secreted from the cells in the brush border of the small intestine, where we showed before with the finger-like projections. And remember that the brush border is where the majority of damage occurs from foods, environmental factors, and medications. This is a great schematic showing the difference between those with normal lactose absorption and those with abnormal lactose absorption. As you can see here in the top figure, lactose enters the small intestine, and if you have lactase, basically it's broken down into glucose and it's absorbed. However, if you have a lactase deficiency, what happens is that the lactose is able to continue along its path along the gastrointestinal tract, and lactose basically attracts water into the lumen of the intestinal tract. And obviously with more water that's found along the intestines, this actually can lead to diarrhea. The other thing that's interesting to note is that things like carbon dioxide are a byproduct of lactose in the intestinal tract, and this actually is what leads to a lot of the gas and the bloating that's associated with lactase deficiency. So typical symptoms, as I just mentioned, associated with lactose intolerance are diarrhea, bloating, and gas. And this can either be alleviated, well, through the avoidance of dairy products and also through the use of enzyme supplementation that contains things like lactase that can help to break down the sugars found in dairy. Lactose intolerance can also be the result of damage to the intestinal lining by viruses, bacteria, or other types of autoimmune inflammatory responses. Lactose intolerance can also be due to genetic factors resulting in a decrease or total absence of lactase production. So how many people suffer from dairy intolerance? Well, it's been estimated that 2 to 3% of children under 2 years of age have a true cow's milk allergy, the full-blown IgE moderated disease. This probably is an underestimation, and there's probably a higher incidence of children with the IgG moderated food intolerance to dairy, although I couldn't find any statistics. And it's been shown that most adults have some IgG antibodies to cow's milk proteins. What's interesting is that there seems to be a connection between both dairy and gluten intolerance. Celiac patients are also susceptible to pancreatic insufficiencies and also epithelial damage of the intestinal tract. And a person with celiac disease may actually have an increased chance of becoming lactose intolerant because, again, the lactase enzyme that's necessary to break down lactose could be damaged. The other thing is that dairy food antigens, once that intestinal lining is damaged, can leak into the bloodstream, causing a dairy food intolerance. And lactose intolerance may actually be responsible for continued symptoms in celiac disease patients who are symptom-free, and lactose malabsorption may improve on a gluten-free diet. This is a good time in the webinar to briefly discuss the connection between food sensitivities and the condition autism. So autism, for those who are not familiar, is diagnosed generally at around age 2 when a child should begin to participate in organized social activities. These children typically have severe deficits in communication, language, behavioral, and social skills. They also have difficulty learning from experience and modifying their behavior to accommodate situations. Now, the etiology, the reason why autism develops is not clearly understood at this point, but seems to be multifactorial with heredity, toxic exposures, vaccinations, mercury, poor liver detoxification pathways, and intestinal hyperpermeability all playing a role in the development of autism. And the hyperpermeability really manifests as dysbiosis, food intolerances, and opioid intoxication. There's a great deal of evidence now that shows that foods containing casein from dairy or gluten contribute significantly to autism spectrum disorders. In a lot of studies, as many as 80% of autism spectrum disorder subjects improved following strict dietary exclusion of these proteins. It's also been suggested that the adverse brain effects associated with dietary casein and gluten are likely due to opioid-acting peptides, also called exorphins, that are generated from these proteins. This was one interesting study that I found. Wright-Kelt et al. Studied 15 autism spectrum disorder subjects, 5 girls and 10 boys, for 1 year after implementing casein and gluten restriction with no other modifiable factors. The results showed that 13 of 15 showed some degree of behavioral improvement. None of them regressed, as judged by parent-teacher consensus. Seizure activity decreased in 3 out of 4 subjects who did have seizure disorder. Gross motor behavior improved in 13 out of 15. Social contact increased. Eye contact improved. And these other things also improved or decreased in the majority of patients. So this is really, really a great study that shows how important eliminating gluten and casein in autistic children really is. This is what a sample IgG food intolerance panel looks like with a child with autism. As compared to the results that we saw earlier, you can just see the amount of foods that are very, very sensitive here in this child. It's amazing. This is a classic leaky gut syndrome presentation where you have all of these foods reacting, especially the dairy column, especially the grains. You can see gluten and gliadin very, very high. Eggs, a lot of the nuts and what you can't see on here is Candida, but that was also high. So that's very, very common in a child with autism. So while we're talking about Candida, let's discuss this a little bit in relation to the IgG food intolerance testing. Candida is a dimorphic, meaning that it takes two forms, yeast that's been considered a normal inhabitant of the human skin, mouth, vagina, and gastrointestinal tract. So someplace along our evolution, Candida decided to hop along and go for a ride with us, and it basically is a commensal organism. It, again, is symbiotic. We give something to Candida, it gives something back. So it's normally found in our intestinal tracts. However, Candida is what's known as an opportunistic pathogen, meaning that if it's allowed to, it will overgrow and cause pathogenicity if that microflora balance becomes altered in any way. So you have the good bacteria and the bad bacteria, and then you also have the opportunistic pathogens that live in your intestinal tract. So it's a fine balancing act between all of these. Obviously, you want more good bacteria than anything else, and you don't want to eradicate them in any way, or else some of these other bad guys are able to take over and damage the immune system. And a number of conditions and medications can eradicate the good bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract, including, as we mentioned earlier, antibiotics, especially broad-spectrum type antibiotics. Those individuals who are immunocompromised, including leukemia, AIDS, those undergoing chemotherapy and also radiation therapy, individuals who have used corticosteroids, and also individuals who have diabetes and alcoholism. So how does Candida sort of exert its effects on the body? Well, leaky gut, as we already talked about, may allow Candida to enter the bloodstream and exert systemic type effects on the body. And other things like gluten may allow this process to occur more rapidly. And what's interesting is that Candida overgrowth may actually potentiate other delayed sensitivity food intolerances. A lot of research tried to debunk the fact that Candida was not a systemic type organism, but believe it or not, recent research has shown that Candida is actually able to cross the intact gastrointestinal wall and cause systemic effects in even non-immunocompromised human subjects. So here's some conditions that have been linked to an overgrowth of Candida and an immune reaction due to Candida circulating in the system. This includes things like vaginitis, thrush in both babies and adults, eczema and atopic dermatitis, respiratory and ear infections, chronic prostatitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, hormone imbalance, fibromyalgia, autism and ADHD, and some of these gastrointestinal disorders, and even cancer, believe it or not. So the Great Plains Laboratories IgG food intolerance test can determine an estimate of the antibody reaction or the sensitivity to Candida. It may not necessarily give a true reading of the current exposure to Candida, but more so how much Candida 1 has been exposed to over a longer period of time. And obviously, in those patients who are suffering from the aforementioned conditions, you would expect a higher antibody level shown on that test. Okay, so next I'd like to discuss a few interesting cases that I've seen in my practice to kind of help illustrate the importance of IgG food intolerance testing and show how a variety of conditions can be linked to the foods that we eat on a daily basis. The first real-life case that I'd like to share is actually my own story. For most of my life, I struggled with the following. I was overweight. At one point in my life, I was 280 pounds. I also suffered from horrible skin rashes. I had eczema on my forehead and eyelids and elbow. And I always think to myself, why is this happening to me? It would be so itchy that I would rub my eyelids and forehead raw. I mean, it just was so incredibly itchy. I'd have outer ear and other recurrent ear infections. Also, I'd have stuffy, plugged, itchy ears and a waxy buildup. Gastrointestinal upset, including bloating and gas, and mood swings and fatigue. These are all very, very common symptoms for people who are suffering from food sensitivities, and I had almost all of them. Following years of trial and error and performing multiple food sensitivity tests, found out that I was sensitive to the following foods: gluten in wheat, barley, rye, and even some oats, the non-gluten-free variety; dairy, almonds, and most tree nuts. I would have a severe reaction to almonds; tomatoes and other nightshades, including peppers and onions. So what Italian man can't eat pasta and tomatoes? It's horrible. Many oils, actually, including safflower oil and sunflower oil, and also chocolate. I know, this is very, very sad. So the results: in my early 20s, through just cutting back on sugar, what I like to call white foods, and dairy products, and increasing the amount of exercise, I was actually able to lose over 80 pounds. So food sensitivities are a very, very important piece to the puzzle. And I've actually maintained at this weight for close to 10 years, which is terrific. The skin on my forehead, eyelids, and elbows cleared up following the elimination of dairy, wheat, and tomatoes. And the instances that I was suffering of ear infections and the gastrointestinal upset was far less. And one of the most important things really was that my mood just improved drastically. You know, the curtain that I felt for the majority of my life, finally lifted, and I was really able to start to see and think more clearly. Okay, so here's another case. This was a 41-year-old male with something called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. He presented to my clinic with complaints of very bad bouts of fatigue, foggy thinking, memory problems, and what he described as a froggy voice. After running tests, we determined that he did have a condition known as Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is basically an autoimmune condition where a person's own antibodies attack their thyroid gland. So after running this IgG food intolerance panel, we determined that he had sensitivities to, as you can see here, dairy, wheat gluten, rye, and also wheat. Eggs had a less severe reaction, and this individual had Candida levels off the charts, as well as the sensitivity to yeast. So, this really is not surprising considering the autoimmune nature of this condition. Most likely the proteins circulating in his system, basically his system said, oh my God, we've got all these proteins circulating around, and what happens is that the antibodies bind, and those antibody-antigen complexes are then able to go anywhere throughout the body once they're in the bloodstream. It's like you get a free ride. And oftentimes they deposit in certain glands, kind of varies from person to person, and one of those glands is the thyroid gland, and it just basically causes destruction of that gland. And unfortunately, this individual really will need to clean up his diet tremendously, and kind of go on some of the therapies that we'll talk about in a few minutes, and to hopefully kind of help to reverse this condition. Another simpler case was a 43-year-old male with chronic sinusitis and allergies. When I hear the term sinus infections and allergies, I oftentimes think of dairy, pretty much immediately as a major culprit. Dairy consumption is one of the leading causes of asthma, allergic rhinitis, and eczema, like we talked about, the atopic triad, especially in children, and I definitely wanted to kind of help to screen and determine if this was what the root cause of this gentleman's problems were. So after running an IgG food intolerance test, it was determined that he did in fact have sensitivities to dairy, and also very high Candida antibody levels as well. So not uncommon to have both of those things going on with allergies and also chronic sinusitis. Okay, so I'd like to close out this webinar tonight with some brief information about treatment strategies that I often employ after determining that an individual has food sensitivities. So first of all, I'm not going to really get into any specific dosages or anything of that nature. Each treatment plan that I perform for patients is obviously patient-specific and individualized to each patient, and it obviously depends on the condition as well. What I will discuss, however, is general treatment strategies. The first and probably the most important one when we talk about food sensitivities is eliminating their food sensitivities. So really to achieve positive results, again, the color coding of the food sensitivity results are green, yellow, orange, and tangerine red. The foods in the yellow range really should be avoided on a rotation basis, meaning that these foods can still be eaten, however, they shouldn't be eaten every day. And typically what I recommend for my patients is eating these foods no more than 1 to 2 times per week. The Great Plains test results package comes with an easy-to-use rotation diet for these foods. So that can be a great tool to say, you know what, I can't eat eggs every day, but I can have them once a week. So foods in the orange range typically should be avoided for 3 to 6 months. And foods in the red range, unfortunately, should be avoided for 6 months or longer to really notice clinical benefit. So if there's a lot of food sensitivities, we must help to be able to repair and heal the leaky gut presentation. So this will overall help to decrease gastrointestinal permeability and prevent some of these food antigens from being able to leak from the gastrointestinal lumen into the bloodstream. A couple of these therapies that I employ include glutamine, something called N-acetylglucosamine, NAG, high-dose essential fatty acids, including fish oils would be another great way to do this, and then high-dose probiotics. Enhancing the immune system. So again, we've talked a lot about how the immune system and the inflammatory system is responsible for a lot of these reactions occurring. So enhancing that immune system is really, really important. Obviously, high-dose probiotics and prebiotics would be one of the best ways to replenish the gastrointestinal flora and help to rebuild that immune system in the gut. Vitamin C and quercetin are 2 other ways that you can help to enhance the immune system, as well as a good quality multivitamin. And we just talked about the importance of reestablishing the gastrointestinal microflora with high-dose probiotics. We also must help the patient's body break down harmful food proteins. Digestive enzymes are a great way to help to be able to break down different proteins into their smaller components. So they may actually be lacking some of these enzymes and may need supplementation. So this really overall will help the patient to, again, break down food proteins and be able to assimilate their food better. And the last treatment principle here is if the person has Candida overgrowth, I typically use a triple therapy, which includes, again, high-dose probiotics, antifungals, which really it just depends on how bad the Candida overgrowth is. There's natural supplements, things like caprylic acid that can be used to eradicate Candida. And then there's stronger things like nystatin, which is a pharmaceutical drug that basically its one job is to eradicate yeast in the body. And another even stronger drug is metronidazole, which is reserved for severe cases and only should be done in short and small quantities because it can cause liver enzymes to raise. Again, the third branch of the Candida program that I employ is going on a Candida diet, which is basically eliminating sugary and also fermented foods, things like vinegar, anything that rises, basically any baked goods, even fruits, unfortunately, have a lot of sugar and should be avoided on the Candida diet. Okay, what can a patient expect following food elimination? Well, sometimes, unfortunately, you get a little worse before you can get better, and this is what's known as a healing crisis. So sometimes during your healing crisis, you can kind of feel like you have the flu. You can feel run down or fatigued. The other thing that I've seen oftentimes is the recurrence of old symptoms, where somebody comes in and we're following up, and they say, you know what, Dr. C, I haven't had the rash in years. What's going on with that? And basically, again, it's the unlayering, the unraveling of all these layers of inflammation that you've developed over years. And detoxification really does occur. Your body basically has 3 major routes of expelling toxins. through the feces, the urine, and the skin. And those typically, you'll notice changes in your bowel movements, possibly in your urination, and skin obviously changes as well. Most people notice that their skin kind of gets a little worse, and then their skin clears up drastically. People are like, my skin hasn't looked this great in years. And then obviously the other thing is that people lose weight pretty rapidly going on a food sensitivity plan. And a lot of that weight is inflammation weight, where basically all of that fluid that's accumulated around those food antigens is now kind of being dispelled. And you can lose, I've seen people lose 10 pounds in 2 weeks going on a food sensitivity plan. The other thing is increased energy, mental clarity. Again, we talked about the skin improvement, less pain, and bowel movement improvement as well. Okay, so that concludes tonight's webinar. Again, I want to thank everybody who attended tonight, and I also want to thank Great Plains very, very deeply for giving me the opportunity tonight to speak. And at this point in time, I'll open the forum for questions, and I'll be answering questions that you've typed in a couple of seconds here.